This week in Syria, the Backstage.
We have been very clear to the Assad regime. A red line for us is a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized.
But then Obama was very weak. At the end of the day, he did nothing. So I'm very critical of President Obama to this day.
Obama's mistakes in Syria left, quote, a more dangerous world.
Right, the Backstage.
Considering taking action as the civil war in Syria intensifies. The White House is reportedly days away from a decision on aiding rebels in their battle against government troops.
In Syria, hundreds more dead, many of them children.
يا شعب بايدوم آمن حنان الحرية
83 people were killed when regime helicopters dropped barrels filled with explosives.
By the summer of 2011, government shelling silences the voices of what had been peaceful protests. The crackdown pressures the Syrian opposition to become organized and militarized. Military defectors established the Free Syrian Army, or FSA.
مرتبات الفرقة العاشرة لواء 85 بسبب المجازر ارتكبها الجيش السوري على انشقاقه عن الجيش أنا ومجموعة من رفاقي المجندين وانضمام للجيش السوري الحر.
Some of the Syrian soldiers who had defected from the Syrian army used their weapons to shoot at the Syrian soldiers.
Syrian army defectors have launched their first attack against President Bashar al-Assad.
They would often go up on the top of buildings and watch for the Syrian army or the Syrian police to come. That's how it started in the summer of 2011.
More than 70 people were killed in yet more clashes between Syrian army defectors and security forces.
Well, the so-called Free Syrian Army, never really was an army. It's a name that was applied to a collection of various opposition elements with varying degrees of effectiveness. And that's been reflected, I think, in the difficulties in trying to convert something like the FSA into an effective fighting force.
It was always more of a name. It's always more of a brand, like McDonald's or like Burger King.
So, the Free Syrian Army, the so-called FSA, is one of many groups that we in the West reached out to in an effort to try to find some group inside of Syria that was not radical and extreme, and who would be willing to really work for the Syrian people, where it's very difficult to find good guys.
The president said that he now recognizes the Syrian opposition forces as the legitimate representatives of the Syrian people.
Behind closed doors, the Obama administration is strongly divided. In one camp, those who see the FSA as a trustworthy ally. In the other, those who have their doubts. And they include the president himself.
After trying to topple Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian opposition is not just losing the war, but also losing support on the international stage.
Ambassador Robert Ford believes the United States needs to get involved in the conflict by supporting the rebels. Otherwise, Syria could slide into anarchy and become another Somalia or Yemen. U.S. State Department code for a failed state.
This hearing will come to order. Thank you all. I apologize for being a moment late. I was there, former U.S. Ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford. I should say ambassador, but not currently in country.
The opposition, as you've noted, is divided, and I think it's probably a reach to think they're going to unify anytime soon into one single organization. I don't think that's going to happen. Because different countries were helping different groups, the armed opposition always stayed divided and therefore was not as effective as it otherwise would have been had it been unified. Can they unite around a vision? And can they unite around a transition plan? They don't all have to unite into one single party.
Some people, myself included, believed that it was very important to help the more moderate elements in the Syrian armed opposition, the Free Syrian Army, that we needed to give them money and supplies and weapons in order to help them recruit the young Syrians who were going to join the fighting. We wanted to prevent those recruits from going to the extremist groups.
What the United States really wanted out of the rebels was two things. They wanted a moderate replacement of the Assad regime, and they wanted a fighting force to combat the more extreme elements of the opposition, including the al-Qaeda's and the al-Qaeda affiliated groups.
Members of al-Qaeda-linked group came to support the fight against the Syrian regime.
At this stage, radicals easily gain ground in Syria.
The first extremists began to arrive into Syria in July and August of 2011. They came from Iraq. They came well armed. Of course, they had experience from the fighting in Iraq, fighting against the Iraqi army and against the American army. And they established themselves in some of the cities, and in particular around Damascus.
A new player came to change the face of the Syrian revolution.
Groups such as the Nusra Front in Syria, by late 2011 and early 2012, had more money. And so young Syrians who wanted to fight frequently joined extremist groups, not because they were extremists. Most Syrians are not extremists. They joined because that's where they could get food, that's where they could get ammunition, and they could even get a small salary, some cash, to help their families. In many cases, who had had to flee their homes because of the fighting and were now homeless, internally displaced people, or refugees in other countries.
Nusra is, the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, and the international community was willing to overlook this because it served their other goal of weakening the Assad regime. And so the rebels, the militants, the terrorists, whatever you want to call them, depending on your political stripe, there's no question that they've been used by outside parties as proxies for their own geopolitical interests.
The U.S. State Department says the al-Nusra Front, linked to al-Qaeda, is trying to hijack the conflict for its own purposes.
There's an expression, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And we see that most vividly with respect to al-Qaeda. In Syria, al-Qaeda's placement was different. Al-Qaeda was seen not as a transnational terrorist group with links to indiscriminate atrocities around the world, but it was seen as freedom fighters.
السلام عليكم كيف حالكم يا شيخ عايزين شيء سلامتكم الله يسلمك بارك الله فيكم الله يجزاكم الخير وعليكم السلام.
Al-Nusra Front, it is linked to al-Qaeda, has emerged as one of the most effective resistance groups against the government.
By December of 2011, they were strong enough, big enough, and organized enough to carry out a set of car bomb attacks against Syrian government secret police facilities in downtown Damascus.
An astonishing strike at the heart of a dictatorship, a bomb right in the command center of Syria's President Bashar al-Assad.
Rebels claim dozens were killed at the army's chief of staff headquarters.
July 2012. a bomb attack in the heart of Damascus kills 3 of Assad's top security chiefs.
They killed and injured a number of very senior Syrian government officials and leaders. As I recall, the intelligence chief and a number of others. These were very prominent individuals in the immediate orbit of Bashar al-Assad.
Among the dead is Assad's brother-in-law.
And they indicated a degree of sophistication when it came to bomb making, a degree of ability to infiltrate areas that one would have thought would be secure, and to wreak a great deal of havoc on senior government officials and then Syrian army bases and a variety of other locations.
It's important to understand how the extremists were well financed and better financed than the moderate elements. That's why people like me, Secretary Clinton, CIA Director Petraeus, were saying we need to help the moderates.
Well, I can't go into specifics about what the CIA laid out as options for President Obama in the recommendation, but ultimately, as is well known, the decision was not taken to support the rebels in a very substantial manner.
You had the president on the one side of the debate in Washington, as far as I can see. You had Hillary Clinton, you had Leon Panetta, who was Secretary of Defense, I believe, at that point. You had David Petraeus, who was CIA director. You know, a whole series of people at the very top of the national security apparatus who were urging Obama to get involved. And the president chose not to.
It was a competition for recruitment between extremists and more moderate people. In the end, unfortunately, the extremists won.
I'm not sure that the right way to put it is that the revolution was hijacked by extremism. I think it probably, this was, as all uprisings, it's not black, it's not white, it's gray.
The al-Qaeda-affiliated Nusra Group has found success against the regime and is gaining in popularity from a public hungry for a win against Assad. The FSA is eclipsed by more radical forces.
Why did it gain strength? It had money. Much of the money was coming from outside, from Gulf countries, from European charity organizations. With that money, they were able to buy on the black market food and ammunition. And the Free Syrian Army was desperately short of food and ammunition.
Slowly, Syria becomes a typical example of a proxy war.
It has now become one of the world's largest net importers of instability, with countries ranging from today Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United States, Russia, Hezbollah, Iran, Israel, all of which have some allies or intervene to some extent in and over Syrian territory.
Shaped by the strategic rivalries between world and regional powers, Syria descends into even greater violence.
صح الهدف 100 متر إلى الأمام 100 متر إلى الأمام.
Bashar al-Assad's regime is on the brink of collapse. But as Assad loses his grip on power, some gaining it may create new threats to the U.S. and our allies.
In 2013, Bashar al-Assad makes a rare public appearance. In a crowded opera house in Damascus, Assad declares Syria in a state of war and labels the opposition as terrorists.
تلتزم فيها الدول المعنية الإقليمية والدولية بوقف تمويل وتسليح وإيواء المسلحين بالتوازي مع وقف المسلحين لكافة العمليات الإرهابية.
Behind closed doors, the regime has a strategy.
It was the Assad regime which decided from a fairly early point to label them all terrorists, and then meanwhile doing everything it could to support and encourage the rise of the most radical elements.
The black flag on top of these tanks has become increasingly more visible in Syria. It's flown by al-Qaeda-linked fighters.
It opened up the jails, allowing Islamists to flood throughout the country in order for the Syrian Arab army to then say that the opposition was Salafist, that they were essentially terrorists. So Assad could ignore the more popular nonviolent protesters.
Syria also appeared to have taken a toll on another terror group, the al-Nusra Front. They operate mainly in Syria, where the group is trying to establish an Islamic State. The U.S. has not said that it targeted the al-Nusra Front.
I think General Petraeus at one point suggested that there were people affiliated with the Nusra Front, the organization affiliated with al-Qaeda, that there were members of that organization that might be weaned away from it and armed and trained.
Well, what I have suggested for consideration is trying to lure away from the Nusra Front, particularly those that were previously in the ranks of the moderates, but who gravitated to Nusra because it was receiving a fair amount of support. And remember, we did do reconciliation in Iraq with some 80,000 former Sunni insurgents and supporters of the Sunni insurgency, and indeed that had been successful. And I think prying away some of those from Nusra, I think would have been a viable option.
Did he say moderate al-Qaeda members? I don't know what it means to speak about a moderate al-Qaeda member, and I certainly would not advocate arming moderate al-Qaeda members. And I said earlier, I don't think that arming the opposition was the way to achieve a positive result for Syrians. Arming an opposition, that's always arming a people who you don't control.
The president believed that it was dangerous to give the opposition too many weapons because it would make the war worse, and the United States would have to become involved directly. And the president did not want to be involved militarily in the Syrian war.
After an assault that is both total and pitiless by President Bashar al-Assad's regime,
Syrian government forces are pounding areas held by rebels. Caught in the fighting are dozens of children.
At this point, Ambassador, you were already feeling some frustration?
Well, of course. Frustration because the violence was increasing. We could see that a bad war was coming. People were getting killed every day. And despite the death, despite the bloodshed, there seemed to be nothing we could do to stop it.
Obama had other priorities in his broader foreign policy agenda, namely the Iran nuclear deal.
We're just getting an idea if you're optimistic about these talks. There's a positive move happening here.
We have a very serious problem of confidence, mutual lack of confidence.
Today, after 2 years of negotiations, the United States, together with our international partners, has achieved something that decades of animosity has not. A comprehensive long-term deal with Iran that will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon.
In July 2015, Iran and the U.S., with the support of France, the UK, China, Russia, and Germany, reached a historic agreement popularly known as the Iran nuclear deal. The deal did come together after 2 years of intense discussions to restrict Iran's nuclear program in exchange for lifting economic sanctions.
President Obama, his number one foreign policy priority, the thing that he thought would make the biggest difference for peace in the Middle East and beyond the Middle East, would be to come to an agreement with Iran on nuclear matters. The president judged, incorrectly in my view, that to push back hard against Bashar al-Assad in Syria might alienate the Iranians and might drive them away from nuclear negotiations.
But while Iran was a success story, Syria continues to fail.
American warnings that Syria could be considering the use of chemical weapons to crush the rebellion.
August 20th, 2012. Barack Obama holds a press conference when a reporter raises the question of the U.S. use of force in Syria. Obama's answer took by a surprise even his administration.
We have been very clear to the Assad regime that a red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus. Thank you, everybody.
Today could go down in history as the day that changed everything in a war that's already killed over 100,000 people.
Did the Syrian government use chemical weapons against its own people, women and children? Is there new evidence?
We warn you, the images can be disturbing.
Almost exactly a year later, sarin gas is used in attacks that kill more than 1,400 people. Sarin is a horrifying chemical that causes paralysis, convulsions, and death.
Potentially one of the worst war atrocities in recent memory. With Egypt also on the brink of civil war, this could be a turning point.
We not only had the Assad should step aside statement, followed up by virtually nothing in the way of strategy to implement the president's spoken desires, but a year later we had the President of the United States making a statement about a chemical weapons red line, a clear warning of force. The possibility of military force if Syria used chemical weapons. And the failure to follow up on those two presidential statements, I think, had serious repercussions for the credibility of the United States and the credibility of the American presidency.
The biggest mistake is a tactical one, letting people talk about so-called red lines with regard to the chemical weapons, when that immediately led to an expectation that there would be an increased use of military force.
President Obama didn't do anything. He said that the use of chemical weapons against Syrian civilians by Bashar al-Assad would be a red line for him, and he threatened the use of military force. But then Obama was very weak. At the end of the day, he did nothing. So I'm very critical of President Obama to this day.
With the U.S. now believing the Syrian government has chemical-filled bombs, the Pentagon is secretly updating military strike options for President Obama.
The White House schedules a retaliatory airstrike on Syria for August 31st. But Barack Obama still has doubts.
Good afternoon, everybody. I have decided that the United States should take military action against Syrian regime targets. I will seek authorization for the use of force from the American people's representatives in Congress.
We've heard this morning of the skepticism on Capitol Hill, even from Democrats, about an attack on Syria. So how risky a move is this for the president?
Now it's a test case for Obama's credibility around the world, and credibility at home. By going to Congress and potentially getting slapped down, the president's credibility at home is in shatters.
However, the fault doesn't solely lie with President Obama. There were a number of those, especially Republican voices in Congress at the time. who argued to have a vote and to have a say as far as what U.S. policy would be. Then when President Obama decided to call them on it and asked them to put up a vote, they refused to do so.
The U.S. president is isolated at home and abroad. Even America's closest ally, the UK, backs away from direct military intervention.
I strongly believe in the need for a tough response to the use of chemical weapons. It is clear to me that the British Parliament, reflecting the views of the British people, does not want to see British military action.
Leaders of the US and the UK both declared that the special relationship between the two countries would be undamaged and that they would continue to work together to find a response to the Syrian crisis.
Well, the discussions at the time in the United States and then also with some of our coalition partners were fairly extensive. There were expectations at various points that decisions would be made. That timeline was continually pushed further, and it was not until a good bit later that the U.S. started taking actions.
I regret that the Americans, we could not convince President Obama to use U.S. military forces after the chemical weapons attack, which killed hundreds of Syrians in the Damascus suburbs. The American failure to act encouraged extremist recruitment on the one side, and Assad continued to use chemical weapons on the other side. So that too I regret.
But the worst was yet to come. In the next episode of Syria, the Backstage, Obama finally takes action. The CIA, Russia, and Iran enter the fray, and division in the White House.
The CIA is